And I want to introduce Richard Wilkinson, co-author of the Spirit Level, which those of you can see up there has been referred to and quoted in The Guardian as the all-encompassing theory of everything. And I think for many people it provides at last real evidence of what many of us thought for a long time about how more equal societies are also more successful societies. As well as a professor of social epidemiology at the University of Nottingham, he's also honorary professor at University College London and a visiting professor at University of York, and he's come down from York today and is off via London on the Eurostar to Brussels this afternoon, this evening. So thank you very much, Richard, for fitting us into your busy schedule. Richard was is also co-founder of the Equality Trust. But look forward very much to hearing what he's got to say, and there will be certainly time for questions, discussion, and debate afterwards. His taxi is booked for 3:30, so that gives you an idea of the timescale. Richard, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here. You seem to have got the best of the sun today. When I left York, it was all a bit gloomy. Still, I have and what I'm going to show you is a sort of brief run-through about. It seems curious. It's actually over 30 years really hard thinking, and now it just all seems entirely obvious. You know, mostly people say, well, I knew that anyway. And because I think people have, for hundreds of years, had an intuition that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. But somehow we didn't realize the data would actually show that. We've done very simple stuff. We've just shown that societies with bigger income differences between rich and poor do worse, not quite on everything, but on almost all the problems that are social gradients. Almost all the problems that are more common at the bottom of the social scale are not just a little bit worse, but much worse in more unequal societies. And they're much worse because it's not just the poor who are affected by inequality, but social relations across the entire society seem to deteriorate, and that leads to more social stress in different ways and worse outcomes. So I'm going to take you through that and try and explain it a little bit. Where I like to start is with this thing that I imagine at the bottom, at the back, this looks like a factory chimney smoking. These are the names of countries, and you've got national income and life expectancy. And what it shows is very simply that the very rapid rises in life expectancy come in the early stages of economic growth. But in the rich world, these countries out here that I'm going to be talking about, there's really no effect of economic growth anymore. Life expectancy goes on increasing. It's not because we've hit the sort of limits of human life expectancy. It's still increasing as fast as at any time over the last 100 years or so. But it increases because this curve moves up over time, so we don't get healthier by moving out along it, by getting richer like that. Even if you're stuck at a given level of income, over time that same level of income seems to buy more health. But what's important about that is if you look at measures of well-being or happiness, there's very much the same pattern. Rapid rises in the early stages of economic growth and then levelling off. And I think we are, in a sense, something's beeping there. I don't know whether it's going to explode. The train was stopped in Birmingham because of some sort of scare for 3/4 of an hour. That's important because I think we are the first generation to have got to the end of the really important social benefits of economic growth. You know, it's transformed the quality of human life over the last 100, 200 years. And yet, this is a curve of diminishing returns to increasing income. It's really important to have more if you're in countries where people haven't got the basic necessities. But for us to have more and more of everything makes less and less difference. And it's fun when new gadgets come out, new phones and so on. I sometimes say how I remember the extraordinary excitement and amazement when I first heard stereophonic sound. And now I don't notice whether it's stereo or mono. And so I think, you know, there's excitement and newness, but it doesn't mean anything very much in the long term. But anyway, you know, within our societies, national income can double over a long period, and measures of well-being show no response at all. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about just these countries on the flat part of this curve, and I'll just blow that little bit of the graph up. Here it is. And you can see that whether countries are like USA and Norway, they're twice as rich as countries like Portugal, Greece, Israel, and yet it makes no difference to life expectancy whatsoever. And yet, I'm sure everyone here knows that health is almost always worse in the more deprived areas, strongly associated with deprivation and so on. But for us all to get richer, the whole society to get richer, doesn't help. That's really important. By the way, I get various criticism from the far right, and one of the things they do is add some of the poorer countries which are down here and say economic growth does matter. Of course it does earlier on, but not amongst the richest countries. Here is the gradient in life expectancy again within our society. These are electoral wards of England and Wales, so small areas, the most deprived this end, low life expectancy, and the least deprived, the richest areas with the high life expectancy. And it's a gradient that goes right across the society, as I'm sure you've heard this morning. And that's an extraordinary contrast. Why does income or deprivation or something matter so much within our societies but not between them? The explanation, of course, is that we're dealing with relative income, social status, where we are in relation to each other, the differences between us. That's what matters, not the absolute living standards. It's not the bricks and mortar that give you cancer or heart disease directly in themselves, but those things are affected by all sorts of sources of chronic stress that maybe we'll touch on later. I'm going to talk a lot about equality and inequality, and I'm never talking about any sort of utopian, unreachable level of equality. I'm simply talking about the differences between the rich, developed market democracies. And the measure we've used, simply because it's easily available and widely understood, you know, there's no problem in understanding. This is a measure of how much richer the top 20% than the bottom 20% in each country. And you see in Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, in each of those countries, the top 20% is only 3.5 or 4 times as rich as the bottom 20%. That's the gap in each of those societies. But in our societies, the gap is twice as big. 8.5 times. That's what the top 20% get compared to the bottom. And I'm going to show you what that does to a society. But I showed you that big graph of the smoke coming out of the factory chimney initially because I wanted to emphasize, and why we look just at those countries is we want to emphasize that we are not dealing with the effects of absolute income. And when I showed you that within societies there are these extraordinary differences but not between them, of course it's about relativities. And I'm going to show you what happens if you widen them or squash them up a bit. What these differences mean to a society. I think that people are often concerned about the social development of our societies, the huge range of problems. I mean, the media are constantly preoccupied with all the social problems that we have. And I think if I had been living in the 19th century and some futurologist had told me the levels of comfort and the living standards that we enjoy now, I'd have imagined we'd be living in some utopia. But when you read about, I don't know, the levels of self-harm amongst girls at school, teenage girls, appalling levels, or that mental illness has been actually increasing, or the news stories not so long ago about how our prison populations had never been higher. An extraordinary range of things, and then of course all the violence and drug abuse and so on, that is a background.
The way that contrasts the social failings with the material success of our societies, and I don't think, people try and explain it, they blame it on parents or teachers or lack of religion or something, but with precious little evidence each time. What we did was collect internationally comparable data on each of those things, just how countries do on all those things with social gradients, as many outcomes as we could get internationally comparable data for. So we got life expectancy for each country, children's maths and literacy scores, you can get them from OECD, infant mortality rates, homicide rates in each country, the proportion of the population in prison, teenage birth rates, trust, that's basically how much people feel they can trust others in general, obesity. Then there's some figures from WHO on mental illness, which include drug and alcohol addiction, and social mobility. And we put them all together in this index of health and social problems. Just think of it as a sort of rag bag of health and social problems. They're all weighted equally. For those of you who know some statistics, a country's position is just its average Z-score for these things. So where a country is influenced just as much by homicides as obesity, as social mobility, and And here you see how well or badly they do on all these health and social problems related to that measure of inequality I've just shown you. And you see an extraordinary clear tendency for the more unequal countries to do worse, and the more equal ones to do better. But if you look at that same index of health and social problems, that same rag bag, in relation to national income per person, there's no relationship. You might think that there's a sort of slight downward tendency, but that's only because Portugal's there. If I cover it up, you can see that why the statistics say there's no relationship. And you see, when we think about these social problems, I think some people think they have a gradient, they're more common at the bottom of society because the vulnerable move down and the resilient move up. That we're basically sorted into a gradient like that. None of that explains why these problems are, I will show you, sometimes 10 times as common in more unequal countries. And the fact that it isn't related to absolute living standards suggests it's not your absolute material conditions that are doing it to you. Whether it is obesity or teenage births or violence or drugs or whatever. When I worked just on a tendency for health to be better in more equal countries, people tried to advance material explanations of that rather than psychosocial explanations. But now that I'll show you separately so many behavioural things like homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth rates, trust, things that, because they're behavioural, we know they must have a psychosocial component. It's what people are thinking and feeling somehow. I think our data shows very clearly that inequality has, if you like, psychosocial effects. Things to do with feelings of, if you like, superiority and inferiority. We were worried, though, that people would think we'd chosen these things not because they're all the stuff you can easily get internationally comparable data on that have social gradients, but that we'd simply selected things to suit our argument. So we also looked at the UNICEF Index of Child Wellbeing,
I don't know whether you remember a few years ago there was a lot of news stories because Britain came bottom. It's a measure made up just to look at child well-being amongst the rich countries. And it contains everything, almost every aspect of children's well-being goes into it. So whether children can talk to their parents and what immunisation rates are like and how they do at school in these maths and literacy tests, that all goes into it. One of the measures actually is the proportion of children in each country in relative poverty. That's rather like a measure of inequality, so we took that out. We didn't want people to say, this is a circular argument. Of course, relative poverty is related to inequality, so we took that out. But the benefit of that UNICEF index, in terms of any potential criticism, people saying we've selected problems to suit our argument, is that we had no hand in selecting that index. In a way, you can think of this as the adult outcomes, and then we move to the children's outcomes. Here's that UNICEF index of child well-being with relative poverty taken out, and you can see a very clear tendency for the more unequal countries to do worse. But to put that same index of child well-being in relation to national income per person, and once again there's no relationship. No suggestion of one. So whether we're looking at this in children's outcomes or the adults' health and social problems or the life expectancy, they all tell us the same thing. That actually getting richer, the whole society getting richer, no longer matters. What does matter is the differences between us. I sometimes feel quite impatient, annoyed with the children's charities that emphasise child poverty all the time without distinguishing between relative and absolute poverty. And that means that it becomes less controversial because people on one side of the political divide can think what we need is incentives to industry and more economic growth and so on. That'll pull children out of poverty. But actually that won't help. It's where children are in relation to the rest of us that matters. What kind of a society they're growing up in, if you like. I'm going to now show you some of the separate components of that index, of our index. This is the proportion of the population who feel they can trust others, who agree that most people can be trusted. I don't know what sort of answer you give. Do you feel most people can be trusted or not? But in the more unequal countries, only about 15% of the population feel they can trust others. Whereas the more equal countries, it rises to 60 or 65%. I think that makes a huge difference to what the social fabric of society feels like. I think it makes a difference particularly to what women feel like walking home alone at night through any of our major cities. I think it makes a lot of difference to all sorts of things. But I haven't said that we've done all this work twice. We did it on these rich developed countries, and then to make sure people didn't say this is just a fluke, something to do with national culture, we repeated it all on the 50 American states, asking just the same question. Do the American states with smaller income differences do better on all these kinds of measures? The picture is very, very similar. There are a few things where there's a difference, but nearly always what is significantly related to inequality internationally is significantly related to inequality in the American states. Here's an example. It's basically the same measure of trust in relation to inequality amongst the American states. You see, it goes up to a very similar level, 60-65%, and falls not quite as low, perhaps, as internationally. But you can see it's a very similar scatter, a very similar range. It's basically the same story.